The morning sun cast long shadows across Eleanor May Johnson's well-tended garden, where purple coneflowers swayed in the gentle Alabama breeze. At 63, Eleanor moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had weathered life's storms and emerged stronger, her silver-streaked hair catching the light as she hummed an old gospel tune her grandmother had taught her. Despite what some might consider advanced years for expecting a child, Eleanor's face glowed with the kind of joy that seemed to light up everything around her. She paused at her kitchen window, watching a cardinal flit between the branches of the old magnolia tree that had stood sentinel over their home for generations. Her hand rested gently on her rounded belly, now 6 months along with what doctors had called her miracle baby. The morning sickness had finally subsided, replaced by an energy that made her feel decades younger. "Just you and me running errands today, little one," she whispered, feeling a flutter of movement in response. Eleanor smiled, remembering how her husband Thomas, with his quiet strength and unwavering support, had insisted on driving her everywhere since they'd learned of the pregnancy. But today, she convinced him she needed some independence. And besides, she had a surprise plan for their anniversary dinner. The streets of Millbrook were alive with the familiar rhythm of small-town life. Miss Sarah waved from her porch as Eleanor passed, her arthritic hands clutching a glass of sweet tea. "Bless your heart, Eleanor. You're absolutely glowing today." Eleanor's sensible flats carried her past Henderson's Hardware, where old Mr. Henderson himself was setting up his daily sidewalk display. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and approaching rain, though the sky remained a pristine southern blue. She'd learned to trust her weather sense over the years. It hadn't failed her yet. Her shopping list was modest. Fresh herbs from the farmer's market for Thomas's favorite roast, and maybe those golden bell peppers Maria always saved for her special customers. Eleanor had already picked up the anniversary card weeks ago, hiding it behind her collection of hymn books where Thomas never looked. The peaceful morning shattered with the squeal of tires against asphalt. Eleanor's heart jumped as a police cruiser pulled alongside her, its white paint gleaming aggressively in the morning sun. Officer James Barrett, though everyone in town called him Barrett, was known for his selective enforcement of the law. Eleanor had heard the whispers, seen the way certain folks crossed the street when his cruiser approached. Barrett's boots hit the pavement with a heavy thud as he emerged from his vehicle. Even in the warmth of the morning, Eleanor felt a chill race down her spine. His mirrored sunglasses reflected her own image back at her, a dignified woman in a powder blue dress, one hand protectively cradling her unborn child. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," Barrett drawled, his tone carrying that false politeness that set Eleanor's teeth on edge. She'd lived through the tail end of Jim Crow, recognized the familiar dance of power and prejudice wrapped in a badge. "Officer Barrett, I'm just heading to the market," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Surely you remember me. I bring cornbread to the church suppers. Your mother particularly enjoys my recipe." Barrett's jaw tightened. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Now, unless you want this to become complicated, I suggest you comply." Eleanor felt the baby shift restlessly within her, as if sensing her distress. She reached for her purse, movements deliberately slow and careful. "I have my ID right here, officer. Though I must say, I don't understand what's suspicious about a pregnant woman walking to the market in broad daylight." Something dangerous flashed across Barrett's face. That look Eleanor had seen too many times before when someone dared to question authority. "You getting smart with me, lady?" "No, sir. Just stating facts." Eleanor kept her voice level, though her fingers trembled slightly as she retrieved her wallet. Years of experience had taught her how to navigate these waters, but something about Barrett's demeanor today sent warning signals through her entire body. The next few moments seemed to unfold in slow motion. Barrett's face contorted with rage at what he perceived as defiance. His boot connected with Eleanor's hip with shocking force, sending her stumbling backward. She felt herself falling, the world tilting on its axis as her hands instinctively moved to protect her belly rather than break her fall. The impact with the sidewalk drove the air from her lungs. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard gasps and shouts from onlookers. Someone was crying out, Maybe it was her own voice. She couldn't tell. The pain bloomed across her side like fire. But all she could think about was her baby, their miracle, their precious gift that she had to protect. Someone call an ambulance. Did you see that? Tell me you got that on video. Oh Lord, Miss Eleanor. The voices swirled around her as she curled protectively around her midsection, tears streaming down her face. Through blurred vision, she saw phones raised, recording Barrett's retreat to his cruiser. The coward was running, leaving her broken on the sidewalk like discarded trash. Maria from the market was suddenly there, her warm hands cradling Eleanor's head, speaking rapid-fire prayers in Spanish. The distant wail of sirens pierced the morning air, growing closer with each passing second. Eleanor's world narrowed to the rhythm of her own heartbeat and the desperate prayer that her baby was safe. "Thomas," she whispered, reaching for her phone with shaking hands. "Someone please call my Thomas." The last thing Eleanor saw before the darkness claimed her was the cardinal from her garden, perched on a nearby fence post, its red feathers bright against the blue sky, a splash of color in a world that was rapidly fading to gray. Above her, storm clouds gathered, just as she'd predicted, their darkness matching the shadow that had fallen over what should have been a perfect morning in their quiet southern town. But storms, as Eleanor knew well, had a way of clearing the air, of washing away the old and making room for something new. She just hadn't expected to be caught in one quite like this. A cool drop of rain hit her cheek, mixing with her tears, as the ambulance rounded the corner, its sirens crying out to a town that would never be quite the same after this day. The rain began to fall in earnest as the ambulance doors closed on Eleanor's unconscious form. Each drop seemed to carry the weight of the morning's events, beating a steady rhythm against the gathering crowd's umbrellas and raincoats. Maria Martinez, still kneeling where Eleanor had fallen, watched through tear-filled eyes as the emergency vehicle pulled away, its sirens piercing the heavy air like a wounded animal's cry. Within minutes, the video of Barrett's attack spread through Millbrook's social media channels like wildfire. Sarah Henderson, who had witnessed everything from her porch, found her arthritic fingers moving with unexpected speed across her phone screen, sharing the footage to every platform she could access. Her granddaughter had taught her about hashtags just last week, and now she typed with trembling determination, #Justice for Eleanor. The rain couldn't wash away the dark stain where Eleanor had fallen, nor could it disperse the crowd that continued to grow despite the worsening weather. Voices rose above the storm's rumble, a chorus of anger and disbelief that echoed through the usually peaceful streets. Mrs. Patterson from the library stood beside Marcus Washington, the high school football coach, both of them sharing the shelter of the hardware store's awning as Th. EY made calls to everyone they knew. "Did you see how he just ran?" Marcus's deep voice carried, thick with disgust, kicked a pregnant woman, and fled like a coward. At Millbrook Memorial Hospital, the emergency room burst into controlled chaos as Eleanor was wheeled in. Dr. Sarah Chun, who had monitored Eleanor's miraculous pregnancy from the beginning, was already waiting, having dropped everything when she received the alert. Her face remained professionally composed, but her hands clenched into fists at the sight of Eleanor's injuries. "Give me an ultrasound stat." Dr. Chen's voice cut through the commotion. "And someone contact Dr. Matthews in obstetrics. I want him here yesterday." Across town, in a sleek office building that stood out among Millbrook's more modest structures, Thomas Johnson sat in a meeting he'd been dreading for weeks. As CEO of Johnson Security Solutions, he'd built his company from the ground up after retiring from a career that official records listed simply as government service. The truth of those years lay buried in classified files and redacted documents, known only to a select few who still owed him favors he'd never called in, until today. His phone buzzed against the polished conference table, interrupting his client's droning presentation about quarterly projections. Thomas normally ignored calls during meetings, but something, instinct honed by years in the field, perhaps, made him glance at the screen. 5 missed calls from Maria Martinez. 3 from Sarah Henderson. A text message that made his blood run cold. Eleanor hurt. Hospital. Come quick. The meeting forgotten. Thomas was on his feet before his mind fully processed the information. His carefully maintained facade of the successful businessman cracked, revealing for just a moment the man he'd been in another life. A man who could make problems disappear with frightening efficiency. "Meeting's over," he announced, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. The clients, startled by the sudden shift in his demeanor, gathered their papers without protest. As Thomas strode through the office, his secretary, Janet, fell in a step beside him, already pulling up directions to the hospital on her phone. She'd worked for him long enough to read the signs, to recognize when the mask of civility slipped to reveal something darker underneath. "Your car's waiting out front," she informed him, efficient as always. "I've cleared your schedule for the week and contacted Mr. Davidson to handle the merger negotiations." Thomas barely nodded, his mind already racing through scenarios, contingencies, and the names of people who owed him favors. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of rain-slicked streets and red lights that seemed to turn green just as he approached, as if even traffic signals recognized the urgency in his manner. The hospital parking lot was already filling with familiar faces from town when Thomas arrived. News traveled fast in Millbrook, and Eleanor was beloved by many. He recognized Reverend Phillips from their church, standing with a group of parishioners who had gathered to pray. The sight would have warmed Eleanor's heart, but Thomas barely registered their presence as he made his way to the entrance. In the emergency room waiting area, Maria Martinez intercepted him, her usually immaculate hair damp from the rain, her eyes red from crying. "Thomas, gracias a Dios you're here." She grabbed his hands, her grip surprisingly strong. That monster bear he kicked her for nothing. Eleanor was just standing there, being Eleanor, and Thomas squeezed her hands once, gently, before releasing them. His voice, when he spoke, was eerily calm. "Where is he now?" "He ran." Maria spat the words like a curse. "Like a coward. But everyone saw. We have videos, so many videos. Sarah Henderson's granddaughter already put them online. The whole world will see what he did." Thomas nodded, filing away the information even as his attention shifted to Dr. Chun, who had emerged from behind the emergency room doors. The doctor's face gave nothing away as she approached, but Thomas had spent years reading people's micro-expressions. The slight tension around her eyes told him everything he needed to know. "Mr. Johnson," Dr. Chun began, her voice professional but gentle. "Eleanor is stable, but—" The word hung in the air like the sword of Damocles, and Thomas felt something inside him shift. The last remnants of the peaceful life he'd built in Millbrook falling away to reveal the steel underneath. As Dr. Chun continued explaining Eleanor's condition, Thomas's mind was already moving in other directions, calculating moves and countermoves like the strategist he'd once been. Outside, the storm intensified, thunder rolling across the sky like distant artillery fire. In the hospital parking lot, people huddled under umbrellas, sharing updates on their phones as the videos of the attack went viral. Hashtag Justice for Eleanor began trending first locally, then regionally, as more and more people saw the footage of a uniformed officer assaulting a pregnant elderly woman in broad daylight. What they couldn't see, was Thomas Johnson's face as he listened to Dr. Chen's diagnosis. They didn't see the cold calculation in his eyes as he made a series of calls, speaking in clipped tones to people whose numbers weren't stored in any phone directory. They didn't see the way his hands, steady as ever, typed out messages to contacts he'd hoped never to need again. In room 312, Eleanor lay unconscious, monitors beeping steadily around her. The rain tapped against the window like nervous fingers, and somewhere in the building, a newborn baby cried, a sound that would have made Eleanor smile any other day. But now she slept, unaware of the storm gathering around her, both natural and man-made. Thomas sat beside her bed, holding her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. To anyone passing by, he looked like any worried husband keeping vigil. They couldn't know that with each circle he traced, he was counting down the hours until James Barrett's world would begin to unravel. The rain continued to fall as day turned to evening, and Millbrook held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In the hospital chapel, Reverend Phillips led another prayer group, their voices rising in harmony with the storm. In the police station, Barrett sat at his desk, trying to write a report that would justify his actions. Unaware that his computer was already compromised, his emails being archived, his phone calls recorded. And in room 312, Thomas Johnson kissed his wife's forehead and whispered, "Rest, my love. I'll take care of everything." The words carried the weight of decades of classified operations, of missions that had never officially existed, of skills he'd hoped to never use again. The storm raged on, but inside the hospital room, Thomas sat perfectly still, a center of calm in the chaos. He'd spent years building a peaceful life with Eleanor, becoming the man she believed him to be. Now, for her sake, he would become someone else entirely, someone Barrett would soon wish he'd never crossed paths with. As night fell over Millbrook, the rain finally began to ease, but the real storm was just beginning to gather force. In the darkness of Eleanor's hospital room, Thomas Johnson began to plan, and somewhere in the city, Officer James Barrett felt the first inexplicable chill of fear run down his spine, though he couldn't yet know why. That inexplicable chill Barrett felt was more than just his conscience catching up to him. As he sat in his dimly lit home office, staring at his computer screen where social media exploded with footage of his assault on Eleanor, his printer suddenly whirred to life unprompted. The sound made him jump, sending his lukewarm coffee splashing across his desk. The page that emerged bore a single line of text. "I see you." Barrett yanked the paper from the printer, crumpling it in his fist as his eyes darted around the room. The digital clock on his microwave flickered, though there hadn't been any power outages. His cell phone buzzed with notifications, hundreds of them, all from unknown numbers, all containing the same message. "We know what you did." Meanwhile, in Eleanor's hospital room, Thomas maintained his vigil, his laptop balanced on his knees as his fingers flew across the keyboard. The soft blue glow of the screen illuminated his face in the darkened room, casting shadows that made him look years younger. Or perhaps it was the way he moved now, with the fluid efficiency of a man who had spent decades in the shadows. "Sir?" A quiet voice from the doorway made him look up. Janet stood there, holding a stack of folders. Even at this late hour, she remained perfectly put together, her gray suit unwrinkled, her expression professionally neutral. "The files you requested." Thomas nodded, gesturing her inside. Janet had been more than just a secretary for the past 15 years. She'd been his eyes and ears in the civilian world, maintaining his cover as a successful businessman. Now, she seamlessly shifted back into her original role as his former field support specialist. "Barrett's complete history," she murmured, laying the folders on the side table. "Employment records, disciplinary actions, both official and buried, financial statements, personal history. Everything we could find in the last 6 hours." She paused, then added, "There's a pattern, sir. Eleanor wasn't the first." "No," Thomas agreed softly, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's peaceful face. "But she will be the last." Across town, Barrett's world continued to unravel in subtle ways. His credit cards were declined at dinner. His home security system began triggering false alarms at random intervals. His computer showed him his own camera feed, proving someone had access to his webcam. His smart TV turned itself on in the middle of the night, playing footage of his own misdeeds, carefully edited clips of excessive force incidents that had been buried in internal affairs files. In the digital realm, Thomas's former colleagues worked their magic. A specialist in Tel Aviv broke into Barrett's personal accounts. A former CIA technician in Seoul manipulated traffic cameras around Barrett's house to create an ever-present sense of surveillance. A data analyst in London compiled every complaint ever filed against Barrett, creating a damning pattern of behavior that would soon find its way to every news outlet in the state. The hospital corridors grew quieter as night deepened, but Eleanor's room remained a hub of carefully orchestrated activity. Dr. Chun made frequent checks, monitoring both mother and child with growing optimism. The baby's heartbeat remained strong, a steady rhythm that seemed to mock Barrett's attempts to destroy this miracle. "Thomas?" Eleanor's voice, weak but clear, cut through his concentration. He was at her side instantly, laptop forgotten. "The baby is fine," he assured her, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Our little fighter is just fine. You both are. Eleanor's eyes, still sharp despite her orderly, caught the strange arrangement of equipment in her room. The extra monitors that had nothing to do with medical care, the sophisticated laptop setup, the folders marked with classifications she shouldn't be able to read upside down. "What are you doing?" she asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew. Thomas considered deflecting, considered maintaining the facade of simple businessman and devoted husband. But their relationship had been built on trust, and after 25 years together, he owed her the truth. "Making sure this never happens again," he said simply. "To anyone." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting protectively over her belly. "Barrett will face justice," Thomas assured her. "Real justice, not just a suspension or a transfer to another department. The legal way?" There was no judgment in her voice, only curiosity. Thomas smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Everything I'm doing is technically legal. It's just complicated." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Like your work before we met?" "Similar methods," he acknowledged. "Different purpose." Outside their room, the hospital hummed with quiet activity. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse laughed softly at something a colleague said. The normalcy of it all stood in stark contrast to the invisible war being waged through computer networks and surveillance systems. Janet appeared in the doorway again, her tablet displaying a series of alerts. "Sir, it's starting. The major networks have picked up the story. The state police are launching an investigation." And she paused, allowing herself a small smile. "Barrett's house alarm is going off again." Eleanor reached for Thomas's hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not just doing this for me, are you?" "No," he admitted. "The files Janet found. There were others. Many others. Barrett's been abusing his power for years, targeting those he thought couldn't fight back." His voice hardened. He chose the wrong target this time. As if to emphasize his words, both their phones buzzed with breaking news alerts. The story was spreading, gaining momentum. Hashtag Justice for Eleanor had evolved into hashtag Barrett Victims as more people came forward with their own stories of encounters with the officer. In his home across town, Barrett sat surrounded by beeping devices and flickering screens, jumping at every shadow. His attempts to contact his union representative went unanswered. The man's voicemail was mysteriously full. His emails to fellow officers bounced back undelivered. Even his home phone line produced only static, punctuated by what sounded like fragments of his own voice reading from the official police conduct manual he had so often ignored. Thomas's network continued their invisible assault. Bank records showed suspicious transfers that would require explanation. Deleted body camera footage mysteriously reappeared in police databases. Anonymous tips about evidence tampering found their way to internal affairs investigators who owed Thomas favors. "How long?" Eleanor asked, watching her husband's fingers move across his keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Not long," he promised. "By morning, he'll be drowning in evidence and allegations. By noon, he'll be suspended pending investigation. By the end of the week." He let the sentence hang unfinished. Eleanor closed her eyes, suddenly tired. "Wake me when it's done?" "Of course." Thomas kissed her hand, then returned to his work with renewed purpose. Outside, the night grew deeper, but in countless server rooms and data centers around the world, justice was taking shape one keystroke at a time. Barrett's carefully constructed world of impunity was being dismantled piece by piece, his power stripped away layer by layer, until all that would remain was the truth he had tried so hard to bury. And in room 312, Thomas Johnson continued his vigil, both protector and avenger, his love for Eleanor giving purpose to skills he had hoped to never use again. The monitors beeped steadily, the baby's heartbeat strong and defiant, while somewhere in the digital darkness, Barrett's world continued to crumble. The night was far from over, and Thomas's work had only begun. But for the first time since receiving that terrible phone call, he felt truly calm. Eleanor was safe, their child was healthy, and justice, real justice, was finally within reach. As the first rays of dawn began to pierce through the hospital window, Barrett's world wasn't just crumbling. It was imploding with surgical precision. The morning news cycle kicked off with an exclusive investigation into his career complete. With previously buried complaints, witness testimonies, and leaked internal affairs documents. Every major network in Alabama carried the story, their coverage a relentless drumbeat of accusations and evidence. Barrett's phone rang at 6:15 a.m. The police chief, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "My office. Now!" The call ended before Barrett could respond, leaving him staring at his reflection in the black screen. He barely recognized himself, unshaven, eyes wild with lack of sleep, his usually pristine uniform wrinkled from the night spent jumping at shadows. His police cruiser wouldn't start. Neither would his personal vehicle. The Uber he called canceled at the last minute. Every taxi service in town seemed to have mysteriously lost his address. In the end, he had to walk the 3 miles to the station, passing neighbors who turned their backs and storekeepers who pulled down their shutters at his approach. Inside room 312, Thomas watched Barrett's progress through a network of traffic cameras, his expression unchanging as he monitored the disgraced officer's walk of shame. Eleanor stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open as sunlight painted the room in shades of gold. "You haven't slept," she observed, her voice stronger than the day before. "I'll sleep when it's finished," Thomas replied, his fingers never pausing their dance across the keyboard. On his screen, multiple windows showed the ongoing demolition of Barrett's career. His personnel file being downloaded by journalists, his bank records being flagged for audit, his private emails appearing in reporters' inboxes. Dr. Chin arrived for morning rounds, her tired smile genuine as she checked Eleanor's vitals. "The baby's heartbeat is perfect," she announced, moving the ultrasound wand carefully over Eleanor's belly. "And look, someone's waving at us." On the screen, their child moved, one tiny hand seeming to reach out toward them. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as Thomas squeezed her hand. For a moment, the machinery of revenge paused as they shared this miracle together. But in the police station, justice continued its inexorable march. Barrett found the chief's office packed with stern-faced officials, state police investigators, FBI agents, representatives from the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. On the chief's desk, a stack of files stood nearly 2 feet high. Every complaint, every incident, every abuse of power he'd thought safely buried. "Sit down, Officer Barrett," the chief commanded, his voice arctic. Or should I say, former Officer Barrett? Back in the hospital, Thomas's laptop chimed with an incoming video feed. Barrett's final confrontation with authority, streaming live through the chief's own computer camera. Janet appeared silently at the door, tablet in hand, coordinating with their network of allies to ensure every moment was documented. "The timing is perfect," she murmured, showing Thomas the latest social media analytics. #Barrett victims had gone national, with major civil rights organizations picking up the cause. Every news outlet from Mobile to Montgomery was running stories about police accountability and systemic abuse. Eleanor watched the activity around her with clear eyes, seeing for the first time the full scope of her husband's capabilities. The quiet businessman she'd married had transformed overnight into something else. Or perhaps he'd always been both, keeping his darker skills carefully sheathed until they were needed. "Tell me about before," she said suddenly, making Thomas look up from his screens. "About who you were. I think I'm ready to know." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands finally stilling on the keyboard. Outside their room, the hospital began to wake up properly. Shift changes, breakfast carts, the steady rhythm of healing. But inside, time seemed to pause as he considered his response. "I work for people who needed problems solved quietly," he began, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes those problems were individuals who abused their power. Sometimes they were entire organizations. My job was to dismantle them, legally, but thoroughly. Like you're doing to Barrett? Similar techniques, yes. Information is power. Money trails, digital footprints, buried secrets. Everyone has them. It's just a matter of knowing where to look and how to use what you find. Eleanor processed this, one hand resting protectively over her belly. "And all these people helping you now? Former colleagues. People who owe me favors. Some who just believe in justice and have the skills to help deliver it." He smiled slightly. I wasn't always proud of my work, but I was good at it. Very good. On his laptop screen, Barrett's professional execution continued. The chief was reading from a list of charges. Not just Eleanor's assault, but dozens of other incidents spanning his career. Each one was backed by evidence that had mysteriously resurfaced. Deleted body camera footage, disappeared witness statements, buried complaints suddenly found in duplicate. Your network is still active, Eleanor observed. All these years, I maintained connections, Thomas acknowledged. Just in case. People like Barrett, they exist everywhere, wearing different uniforms, carrying different badges. Sometimes the system protects them. Sometimes it needs help bringing them down. A knock at the door interrupted them. Reverend Phillips, come to check on Eleanor. Thomas smoothly minimized his windows. Once again the concerned husband rather than the architect of Barrett's destruction. But Eleanor saw him differently now, understanding at last the subtle signs she'd noticed over their years together. The encrypted phone calls, the mysterious business trips, the way certain problems in their community seemed to solve themselves after catching his attention. As the Reverend prayed with Eleanor, Thomas's phone buzzed with updates from his network. Barrett had been officially terminated. State investigators were expanding their probe to include other officers in the department. The FBI was opening a civil rights investigation. Justice, like an avalanche, had begun its unstoppable descent. You're not going to stop with Barrett, are you? Eleanor asked after the Reverend left. Her voice held no judgment, only understanding. Thomas met her eyes, seeing in them the same strength that had first drawn him to her decades ago. The department has a cancer, he said simply. Barrett was just a symptom. The whole system needs cleaning. Eleanor nodded slowly. Then do it. But Thomas? She squeezed his hand. Come back to me when it's done. Come back to us. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. Always. Outside their window, Millbrook was waking up to a changed world. Barrett's face was on every news channel, his crimes laid bare for all to see. But in room 312, a different kind of change was taking place. A marriage growing stronger through revealed truths, a future taking shape in the flutter of an unborn child's heartbeat. Thomas returned to his laptop, his network of allies waiting for his next commands. The dismantling of Barrett's world had been just the beginning. Now came the real work, systematic, thorough, unstoppable. Eleanor watched him work, finally seeing him whole, not just the man she'd married, but the force for justice he'd always been. The morning sun climbed higher, its light catching the silver in Eleanor's hair, gleaming on Thomas's wedding ring as his fingers moved across the keyboard. In the digital realm, justice continued its relentless advance. But in room 312, something even more powerful was at work. Love, understanding, and the unshakable bond between two people who had chosen each other, secrets and all. As the days unfolded in room 312, the quiet beeping of medical monitors provided a steady backbeat to Thomas's digital orchestra of justice. Eleanor's Rico progressed steadily, her natural resilience aided by the constant stream of visitors bearing flowers, home-cooked meals, and righteous indignation. But it was during the quiet moments between visitors that the real transformation occurred, both in their marriage and in the town of Millbrook itself. Thomas's network had expanded beyond Barrett, their digital tendrils reaching deep into the department's darkest corners. Each day brought new revelations. Officers who had covered for Barrett, supervisors who had buried complaints, administrators who had looked the other way. The dominoes fell one by one, each resignation or suspension accompanied by leaked evidence, so damning that no defense was possible. The captain's going to resign tomorrow, Janet reported one evening, her tablet displaying a draft of the resignation letter that hadn't yet been written. His offshore accounts had become surprisingly visible to federal investigators. Eleanor, sitting up in bed and looking stronger by the day, watched the proceedings with growing understanding. The business trips Thomas had taken over the years suddenly made more sense, each one coinciding with the downfall of some corrupt official or the exposure of institutional wrongdoing in distant cities. Kansas City, 3 years ago, she said suddenly, making Thomas look up from his work. When that judge was exposed for taking bribes. That was you, wasn't it? Thomas's slight smile was answer enough. The justice system works best in sunlight. Sometimes it just needs help finding the switch. Their conversations during these quiet evening hours had taken on a new depth. Eleanor shared stories of her own battles against injustice, subtle resistances, and quiet victories during the civil rights era. Thomas, in turn, began to fill in the gaps of his mysterious past, painting a picture of a shadow warrior who had turned his skills toward justice rather than mere government interests. I was recruited straight out of college, he explained one night, his laptop displaying real-time surveillance of Barrett's now empty house. They wanted people who could think differently, who could see patterns in the chaos. I was good at it, too good, maybe. But after a while, I started questioning who I was really working for. So you went private, Eleanor supplied, understanding dawning in her eyes. Independent, he corrected gently. I chose my own targets, fought my own battles. Usually against people like Barrett, those who abused their power, who thought their positions made them untouchable. Outside their hospital sanctuary, Millbrook was experiencing its own reformation. The police department, under intense scrutiny, began implementing reforms that had been resisted for years. Body cameras suddenly worked without fail. Complaint forms became easily accessible. Training programs were overhauled, with a new emphasis on de-escalation and community relations. But the real change was happening in the hearts and minds of the townspeople. Those who had stayed quiet about past injustices found their voices. Support groups formed. Town hall meetings became forums for long-overdue conversations about power, privilege, and accountability. You planned this, Eleanor observed one afternoon, watching coverage of a peaceful protest outside the police station. Not just Barrett's downfall, but all of it. Thomas nodded, his fingers moving steadily across his keyboard as he orchestrated the next phase of revelations. A system doesn't change unless it's forced to. Barrett was the catalyst, but the real goal was always bigger. Janet appeared at the door, her expression suggesting news. Sir, the FBI's expanding their investigation statewide. Similar patterns have been identified in 3 other departments. Good, Thomas replied, not looking up from his screen. Make sure they find the Connor County files. Those should be illuminating. Eleanor watched this exchange with a mixture of pride and amazement. The quiet man who had won her heart decades ago, who had attended church socials and business meetings with such apparent normalcy, was simultaneously a force for systemic change. Yet his love for her, his gentleness, was entirely genuine. Do you ever miss it? She asked softly. The excitement of your old life? Thomas finally looked up, his eyes soft as they met hers. I never left it, not really. I just found a better reason to fight. The baby chose that moment to kick, as if agreeing with its father. Eleanor laughed, guiding Thomas's hand to feel the movement. For a moment, all thoughts of justice and retribution faded, replaced by the simple joy of impending parenthood. But the quiet moment was interrupted by new alerts on Thomas's laptop. Barrett had been spotted trying to leave town, his hastily packed bags suggesting flight. Within minutes, state troopers had been anonymously tipped off about his location. The net was tightening. He's running, Janet reported from the doorway. Let him, Thomas replied calmly. Every movement, every transaction, every attempt to hide, it all just adds to the evidence. Sometimes the prey has to believe it has a chance to escape before the trap can truly close. Eleanor watched her husband work, seeing now the precision with which he orchestrated Barrett's final downfall. Each apparent escape route had been carefully prepared, each potential ally systematically compromised. Barrett wasn't running from justice. He was running precisely where Thomas wanted him to go. As night fell over Millbrook, the hospital quieted once again. But in room 312, the work continued. Thomas's network hummed with activity, tracking Barrett's desperate flight, documenting every damning decision. The evidence mounted, the case strengthened, and the possibility of escape dwindled with each passing hour. When will it end? Eleanor asked, not meaning just Barrett's flight. Thomas considered the question carefully. The immediate threat, Barrett, his enablers, the departmental corruption, that's almost finished. But the real work, the systemic change, that's just beginning. She nodded, understanding. The man she married was more than just a retired operative or a successful businessman. He was a force for justice, working in the shadows to bring light to dark places. And now, with their child on the way, his mission had taken on new urgency. "Our baby will be born into a better world," she said softly, her hand resting on her belly. Thomas saved his latest work and closed his laptop, moving to sit beside her on the bed. "That's the goal," he agreed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. One corrupt official, one broken system at a time. Outside, Millbrook slept, its citizens unaware of the invisible war being waged through computers and surveillance cameras. But in room 312, husband and wife held each other, their love strengthened by shared purpose and revealed truths. Their child moved between them, a reminder of why the fight for justice mattered. Not just for them, but for all the Eleanors who would come after, who deserved a world where power meant responsibility, not immunity. The monitors beeped steadily, a lullaby of healing and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles in the never-ending fight for justice. But for now, in the quiet of their hospital room, Thomas and Eleanor Johnson were simply a family, bound by love, truth, and the promise of a better future. The promise of that better future began to materialize sooner than anyone expected. As dawn broke over Millbrook the next morning, Barrett's desperate flight came to an inglorious end at a small gas station just outside of Montgomery. The state troopers who arrested him found a man broken not by force, but by the weight of his own exposed crimes. In room 312, Thomas watched the arrest unfold through the gas station security cameras, his network having long since gained access to every digital eye in the state. Eleanor sat beside him in a comfortable chair, her breakfast tray momentarily forgotten as Barrett was led away in handcuffs. "He looks so small," she observed, watching the man who had once terrorized their community now shuffling defeated between officers. "Bullies usually do, once their power is stripped away," Thomas replied, his fingers dancing across the keyboard as he ensured every moment of the arrest was preserved and distributed to key media outlets. Janet appeared at the door, her tablet displaying multiple news feeds. "It's trending nationally now. Civil rights organizations are calling it a watershed moment in police accountability. The governor is planning to announce a statewide review of police practices." But Thomas wasn't finished. As Barrett sat in a holding cell, digital ghosts continued to haunt him. Every device in his possession seemed to turn against him, his phone displaying an endless stream of his victims' faces, his tablet repeatedly playing the video of Eleanor's assault. Even the holding cell's intercom occasionally whispered fragments of his own racist rants, captured by his cruiser's supposedly malfunctioning microphone over the years. "Is all that really necessary?" Eleanor asked, noting the slight smile on Thomas's face as he monitored Barrett's growing distress. "Psychological pressure," Thomas explained. "We need a complete confession, not just for your case, but for all of them. Every victim deserves to hear him admit what he did." The hospital room had become something of a command center, though to casual visitors it appeared normal enough. Behind the get-well cards and flower arrangements, a sophisticated operation continued to unfold. Thomas's network had expanded their focus, identifying similar patterns of abuse in departments across the state. Dr. Chen arrived for morning rounds, pleased with Eleanor's progress. "The baby's vitals are excellent," she announced, moving the ultrasound wand with practiced ease. "And your blood pressure is finally stabilizing. I think we can start talking about discharge planning." The news brought smiles to both Eleanor and Thomas, though for different reasons. Eleanor was eager to return home, to sleep in her own bed and continue preparing for their child's arrival. Thomas saw an opportunity to expand his operation beyond the constraints of the hospital room. "Janet," he called softly after Dr. Chen left, "prepare the house." Those 3 words set in motion a flurry of activity. The Johnson residence, already equipped with state-of-the-art security systems, though the neighbors had always assumed it was just Thomas being an overprotective husband, began to transform. Hidden servers hummed to life in the basement. Satellite uplinks established secure connections. A command center worthy of any intelligence agency took shape in Thomas's home office. Eleanor watched these preparations with growing understanding. You're not stopping with Barrett, are you? Or even with our local department? Thomas paused in his work, considering how to explain. What happened to you? It wasn't an isolated incident. Barrett was a symptom of a larger disease. And now that we have the attention of the right people, the resources in place, you're going to clean house across the entire state, Eleanor finished for him. She was quiet for a moment, then added, good. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Reverend Phillips had arrived with a delegation from the church, carrying not just prayers this time, but news. The mayor had announced the formation of a civilian oversight committee for the police department. More surprisingly, they wanted Eleanor to chair it once she recovered. The community needs your voice, the Reverend explained, his kind face serious. Your experience, your wisdom, and your courage in standing up to Barrett has inspired people. Eleanor looked at Thomas, seeing the subtle nod of approval. This, too, had been part of his plan, not just destroying the corrupt system, but helping to build something better in its place. As the day progressed, Barrett's interrogation began. Thomas watched through secured feeds as the former officer faced questions about not just Eleanor's assault, but dozens of other incidents. With each passing hour, the facade crumbled further, until finally, late in the afternoon, Barrett began to talk. It's done, Janet announced quietly, entering the room with a tablet displaying Barrett's confession. He's naming names, dates, incidents, everything. Thomas nodded, satisfied, but his fingers never stopped moving across his keyboard. On multiple screens, data flowed in streams of code and encrypted messages. The operation had grown beyond Barrett, beyond Millbrook, spreading like a cleansing fire through the corrupt infrastructure of power. Eleanor watched her husband work, seeing now how seamlessly he balanced his two worlds, the loving husband preparing for their child's arrival, and the shadowy operative dismantling systems of oppression. She understood at last that these weren't separate aspects of his personality, but rather two expressions of the same core truth. Thomas Johnson was, above all else, a protector. As evening approached, Dr. Chun returned with discharge papers. Tomorrow morning, she announced with a smile, as long as all your vitals remain stable overnight. The news brought a flurry of activity. Janet began coordinating the transfer of equipment to the house. Thomas's network adjusted their protocols for the transition. But beneath the tactical preparations, there was also the simple joy of a family preparing to return home. Our little one will have quite a story to tell someday, Eleanor mused, her hand resting on her belly as she watched the sunset through the hospital window. Thomas set aside his laptop and joined her, his hand covering hers. A story of justice, he agreed, of standing up to bullies and fighting for what's right. Of love, Eleanor added softly. Don't forget that part. Everything you've done, everything you're still doing, it all started with love. The monitors beeped steadily in the background, the baby's heartbeat a reminder of why their fight mattered. Outside, Millbrook was changing, awakening to new possibilities of justice and accountability. And in room 312, Thomas and Eleanor Johnson held each other, their shared purpose stronger than ever, their love deeper for having weathered this storm together. The night settled over the hospital, but in countless servers and hidden networks, Thomas's work continued. Justice, like their unborn child, was growing stronger by the day, preparing to reshape the world it would inherit. And in the quiet of their room, husband and wife began planning not just for their family's future, but for the better world they would help create, one corrupt system at a time.